Everyone, welcome to another Shmup Patreon video. This topic is for Mark Sloan, and this is something I actually wrote a little blog post about years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, before I even started making the podcast. I never actually published that post, it just is still sitting on my computer. But the post was all about, and this is something I'm sure you've all heard about or maybe thought about, the term shmup. And how people feel about it. Is it a stupid term? Is it a good term? Should we try and move away from the term? Should we try and use something else? And just all the different naming conventions for this genre. And so whenever I think about this topic, I always think about a podcast that I listen to and follow called the Completely Unnecessary Podcast. And one of the co-hosts of the podcast, Ian, is a shmup fan. But he does not like the term shmup. He definitely has made it clear he despises the term. And so in many episodes of the show, when he's talking about shmups, he refers to them as shooters. And his reason for that, and I've heard other people this as well, it's not just him, that the genre began life known as shooters back, in the 2D days before FPSs came around and those types of things. And so he likes to continue to refer to them as shooters. I've actually had people comment on this as well in various videos, or I've seen a little bit of it on Discord, but not that much. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about this topic and kind of put what I think about it, and also, I guess, kind of just explore what directions we could go in. So for me, I understand that people find the term shmup distasteful, because it sounds a little silly and it sounds a little stupid. It's a mashing together of shoot 'em up, and you're just shortening it all into shmup. Honestly, it's a very 90s internet type of thing to do. I think there's other terms like that, 90s internet. That's what it always reminds me of something you'd say in the 90s. So yeah, shmup. The funny thing is that term, I know it started out life as kind of an internet thing, because I remember my friend talking about it and actually saying shmup when we were playing Sexy Parodius. I was like, what's a shmup? He's saying, oh, it's a shoot 'em up game. It's this game. It's Raiden. So a shmup, a shooter now becomes shmup. And then I've also heard people mention, well, why don't we just go back to referring to them as shooters, take back our rightful place in the genre's naming conventions. The problem is that I honestly do not think that is possible, other than if you go out of your way to explain it every single time, and to the point where that kind of becomes a little bit cumbersome and a little bit against the goal, right? For instance, every time Ian, or almost every time he mentions shooters on his podcast, regular listeners know what he's talking about, but I'm sure new listeners have no idea what he's talking about, and then he has to explain in the episode a shooter, a shmup, or whatever. He has to explain the genre every time he uses that term, because people are going to immediately think of first-person shooters. And in fact, I did a little research for this. If you type in shooter into Steam, a shmup might sneak in there, but the vast majority of shooters are third-person or first-person shooters. So I feel like there's a very interesting analogy we can make here of, if you guys are familiar with the famous, you should be anyway, because he's extremely famous, the famous singer The Weeknd, spelled W-E-E-K-N-D. So the reason why his name is spelled The Weeknd without the E is because in Toronto, when he was creating his name, there was another singer called The Weeknd, and he had the full spelling, W-E-K-E-N-D. So he had the famous singer had to remove the E to, for legal reasons or copyright reasons or whatever. However, since then, he has gone on to be a worldwide phenomenon and sensation, and he is now The Weeknd. And so that Toronto guy, who's still going by The Weeknd, I imagine he runs into this all the time. If he's stuck with the name The Weeknd, and he gets booked for shows and stuff, and everyone's expecting the world famous person, or whenever people are talking about him, they're always going to think of the world famous singer without the E. And so if I was his agent, I would say, okay, dude, you need to change your name. Your name has been usurped. It has been taken over by a worldwide phenomenon. And no matter how much you explain to venues or to whoever that you were originally the weekend before this other guy took your name, no one's going to care. And I kind of feel like that's the situation with Shmups. Is we can explain all day long that we're actually shooters, that was our name and it got jacked by FPS and third person, but those genres are just too massive, they're too powerful to ever really take away their name from them at this point. So that's why I think shmup actually is a more useful term to use, because it's very unique and more clearly identifiable. What is a shmup? Okay, we all know what that is if you know what it is. You're not going to get confused if it's a first-person shooter, a third-person shooter, a 2D shooter. And if you find that name extremely distasteful because it sounds too silly for you, there's also the Japanese term, which is STG, shooting game, but they do it license plate style, where they just take out, the letters STG. So you can go by STG. The only issue that I have with STG is that it's extremely unknown. It's pretty obscure. So if you say to your friend, "Oh, a great new STG came out," they're gonna have no idea what you're talking about. But it is possible you might say, "A new shmup came out," and they're like, "Oh, okay, shmup, I know what that is." Same thing so that's going to be an issue with STG. So I think within the scene, I think it's perfectly fine to use that term. I know the French seem to use that term quite a bit. The Japanese, obviously, it's their term for it. They don't call them shmups. However, I think one thing we gotta also recognize is that shmup, again, it sounds silly, but there's a lot of actually strong qualities in that title. The first is that it does shorten what it actually means, so shoot 'em up. If you go by shoot 'em up, that's just a lot to say, and I think that's why shmup was created, to kind of condense that. And then also, when you think about it in kind of a marketing sense, or when you're creating videos or creating content, or even on Steam, you want something that's short and identifiable and easy to type. And shoot 'em up, there's always that question, do you put the apostrophe on the EM? Do you leave it out? It's just a complicated term, whereas shmup is, short word, and it is identified directly with the genre. So personally, as silly as it sounds maybe, I actually think that shmup is a good term to use, and it's something I will obviously continue to use. Even if I hated the term, even if I thought it was really stupid, I would still have to use it because it is now the genre name. It would be kind of unnecessarily creating barriers for myself and other people by choosing not to use the term. For instance, like when I'm typing in titles in YouTube, or when I'm using the tags on my videos, I always put shmup and STG in there. I throw STG in there just in case the Japanese players are looking for something. But shmup is how people are going to find my content and how they're going to find your game. So if you create a game, a shoot 'em up game, a space shooter, the problem is I've heard of other ideas, like maybe we should call it a space shooter, or we should call it, something shooter. The only issue is that's not quite accurate, because the genre is so varied that Mushihime-sama is not a space shooter. Sexy Parodius is not a space shooter. There's many shmups. Even Ketsui is not a space shooter. Ketsui takes place on a planet. So there are many shmups that do not fall into the area of space, so that wouldn't make sense. And I also feel like another cool thing about shmup that I enjoy is it's kind of ambiguous. It's kind of a little bit, you have to kind of follow up what that means. And the thing is, I feel like as a genre, shmups are actually somewhat ambiguous by their nature. I remember I was a guest on the Frame Savers podcast, and I planned out all my segments and all those sorts of things. And the first thing he asked me, which I don't think he felt I needed to plan out. It's not something that would have been out of the ordinary, but just to get introduced, he's like, "What is a shmup?" And oh boy, I was like, okay, wait a minute. That's a more complicated question than it seems, actually, because shmups are many things, right? So I tried to say, okay, well, shmups auto-scroll. That's kind of universally accepted as part of the genre. You shoot stuff. You dodge bullets. And then it's like, well, anything you say from that point on where it starts to get more untrue, because there are shmups that are going to break those rules. There are going to be shmups that are different. In fact, there are shmups that do not auto-scroll. Like there's some arena shmups and stuff. Even if you don't want to count certain games, there's still shmups that do not auto-scroll. Like Fantasy Zone, there you go. Fantasy Zone does not auto-scroll, but is clearly a shmup. Or Defender, you know. So those are kind of like, okay. So it gets even that you know, refined. Or you can say, well, it's a shmup where you shoot stuff. Well, there are shmups where you don't shoot, you just dodge. So, and then you could say, well, it's a shmup that you dodge stuff. But again, that's so ambiguous that I feel like that's why I kind of like the term shmup, is that it's an ambiguous term for an ambiguous genre. You know, it's not really cut and dry. Whereas platformer, you're jumping on platforms. Fighting games, you're fighting other characters, you know. Shmup, you're flying around, dodging projectiles and shooting enemies. Like, it takes more to explain what a shmup is than most other video game genres. So that's another reason why I feel like it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world that we call our genre by kind of an oddball name. It's a kind of a weird genre. So yeah, that's basically the topic. The summary of my thoughts is that I think it's probably just more healthy to embrace the term and move forward with it, kind of own it, you know, take charge of it rather than trying to shun it away. And then because it's so connected to the games now, it's just so, it's there. We're not going to get rid of this term, so I feel like it's a little bit better to embrace it. And I also kind of want to shy away from any sort of elitism that might come up with this type of thing, right? Because what's going to happen is if we say, no, we're not calling these shmups anymore, the real term is shooters, or the real term is STG, right? That immediately creates a language barrier for new people coming in, where a new person's going to show up and say, oh, I love shmups. And so if we create this environment where we say, oh, shmups is a stupid term and we shouldn't use it, then what's going to happen is a new person's going to show up in our Discords or forums or wherever, and they're going to say, oh, I love shmups. I played shmups when I was 12 and I'm getting back into them, and, you know, whatever the story is. And then we all kind of chuckle to ourselves and go, what a scrub. He thinks they're called shmups. Obviously a noob. The correct term is spaceship shooter or STG. See, that's something I don't want either. I'd rather use the colloquial term, use the widely known term. That way we're not creating that elitism barrier with new people coming in and creating in crowds and out crowds by having our own little special lingo for the genre. That's my 2 cents anyway. I think it's a pretty fun topic, so thanks for watching, and let me shout out my patrons. So shout outs to Dingo, Kiwi, Young Money Swee, Psych, Retro Schmupper, Himmel, Dunpeel 2064, Mark Sloan, Jake Ryan, Joe Angelo, Kay, Maz, Plasmo, and Nathaniel Davis. And an extra shout out to Mark Sloan for being the man behind this video. Thanks for watching.